Welcome to the Startup Grind.
We'll introduce David now. So David was co-founder of Divide, which has since been acquired by Google. This is the only company that has sort of a base in Hong Kong that's been acquired by Google. Divide's 3 co-founders were spread out between London, New York, and Hong Kong when they were acquired, right? So it's kind of a unique situation, but we're going to call them a Hong Kong company and say that they're the only Hong Kong company that's been acquired by Google. So previously, he was a director of engineering at Smule, has worked at Morgan Stanley, HP. He has a degree in computer science from Stanford, and he started out hacking mobile devices. That's what I got. We'll have to get some more on that.
Sure.
And David is originally from the US. He's from Tucson, Arizona. And he apparently can hack the heat, but not the humidity so much, he says, here in Hong Kong. He's been here since 2009, but still hasn't adjusted to the humidity. I haven't adjusted either, but thankfully it's cooling down here. So with no further ado, we're going to jump into the interview, but let's welcome David here tonight. All right, so this is pretty casual. I'm going to ask David a bunch of questions. Whatever questions I don't ask him that you want to know about, at the end we'll have a Q&A and we'll open it up and you guys can ask questions as well of David. We'll probably go about 45, 50 minutes with me interviewing him, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and we'll go along with that until people get tired. So, or until David keels over. So give us, well, so let's talk about Google first, just a little bit. Let's just get that off the table.
Okay.
What's your favorite room at the Google offices?
In Hong Kong, or?
Yeah, the Google Hong Kong offices.
Okay, so I think I can actually talk about this. So I'm sure you guys have seen like online videos of like Google offices in general, right? So the cool thing about Hong Kong is, okay, generally like all the conference rooms have a theme, right? So in Hong Kong, my favorite room is this room called Typhoon Shelter, which of course Hong Kong gets, tsunamis and things like that, right? What's quite fascinating is that then on the wallpaper of Typhoon Shelter room is all dim sum, right? So imagine like you walk in, the room's called Typhoon Shelter. There's like like char siu bao and like basically all the dim sum food on the walls. And I think that's a fantastic room to work out of, especially because you walk in and you just feel hungry.
Okay, so now that you're making us hungry, so tell us about the food situation. Can you talk about the food situation at the Google offices? So what's the best thing in the fridge at the Google office?
Okay, so I think that's also a safe area we can get into. So of course, Google is famous for just effectively it's like 3 square meals a day. I don't think you ever have to go hungry at Google, right? So what's interesting is, so I've had the pleasure of visiting multiple Google offices, for example, Mountain View, the headquarters, and also London and Hong Kong. So cuisine is definitely catered to each area, which is nice. So for example, if you were to ask my staff, they would claim that Hong Kong has the best Google cafeteria of anywhere in the world, but I think that's because Google Hong Kong cooks primarily to the Asian taste, right? So they get a lot of the local delicacies and just pretty much things you would find in like tea cafes locally, right? It's a lot of just native stuff, which is nice. But yeah, I mean it's pretty good.
Yeah, I went and visited David the other day at the office, and I got there just a few minutes too late to enjoy lunch. But they have this whole area there. And then he's offering me ice cream out of the fridge. That's the first time anybody's offered me ice cream at a business meeting, but that was great. So what's your favorite perk of being a Google employee now that you're part of Google?
Wow. Okay, I think that's a hard one. But I will say, and maybe this is going to sound really cliche, actually. But I think it's the people, right? And I think for me personally, I've always enjoyed the people that I work with, right? Even going back to like all my previous jobs and things like that, I think one thing I've always valued is the people I get to work with. And I think Google is huge at this point, right? I mean, they are really big. I mean, even though I think they try to hold on to a lot of that startup mindset, and certainly I think a lot of things they do internally, they do try to stick to a startup mindset, right? But in terms of just sheer headcount, I mean, it's pretty humongous. But the cool thing is, they have so many like deep industry experts that work there, right? I mean, come on, it's like, James Gosling, right, inventor of Java, works there. Vince Cerf, the inventor of TCP/IP, the internet, works there. I mean, there's really awesome, like in-depth people, like industry titans and giants that I think like you can try to get on their calendar for a meeting, which is pretty cool.
Is there anything that surprised you that was unexpected about Google once you started working there?
Not really, I would say. I mean, I think generally I knew that, even though they are Google and they're certainly, I think, one of the, premier technology companies in the world today, they're still a big company. I think going in, I knew that it would not be quite like a startup, right? I mean, obviously, for example, their communications department. I mean, I love them and they're fantastic, but I think, they are a big company and they just have to, be mindful of big company things, right?
Yeah, and a public company too. So.
Right, exactly. So, lots of things you can't talk about.
Yeah. Well, let's back up a little bit. Let's go back to when you were younger. Is there anything, looking at where you are today, is there anything, any moment, any event that you can look back to and say it kind of all started with that? Like some exposure to old computers or something that you say, wow, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here today?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess going back, growing up, I was always kind of like a tech nerd, right? Interestingly, and I think this is a funny story I like to tell, so I was a Mac user actually for like a really long time, right? Like I started using Mac as System 6, right? Before they had multi-finder. So literally it was a single threaded operating system, right? And I think my claim to fame is that I liked Macs before they were cool. Like I literally used Macs when people were like dogging on me for not having a PC, right? People were like, oh, this new game just come out, but guess what? You can't play it on the Mac. And I'm all like, oh. But like I've always loved Macs, and I first started programming actually on Macs, right? So been a Mac guy my whole life. But if you want to say like, so I guess my interest in technology certainly I think goes back pretty early days, right? I remember when I was really young, like this was BBSs, right? Before I guess internet became really famous.
So what year are we talking here?
Early 90s, right? Basically, you would have to dial locally into your bulletin board, right? And then, they would only have like 1 or 2 lines. And if they were busy, you would have to like call back, like 30 minutes later for someone else to log off before you can log on. And I remember actually playing a lot of door games, as they were called back in the day. Basically, they were like really early versions of like modern MMOs, if you want to think of it that way, right? But basically, they're games that are hosted at the bulletin board, but then only really one person can play at a time, so you all kind of take turns, right? But it's still a lot of fun because you're playing against real people, right? So like you'll log on and maybe do something, and then next day you log on and you realize that your entire city's been taken over, or like all your people got killed, and but it was great fun.
If you guys have no idea what we're talking about, go watch the movie War Games from the 80s. It will educate you on all this stuff.
So definitely showing my age. Yeah, so my first modem was a 2400 baud. So if people remember how slow that was.
They don't even know what baud means.
That's probably true, yeah.
Yeah, it was like doing the internet through fax machines or something. It was a different time.
Yeah, and then I guess my first exposure to internet, I think I was lucky because my dad worked for the University of Arizona. Right, so he had an access to an email account, which of course he never used. So I kind of like took his account over, and that's how I was able to get onto the internet back basically in the early 90s, right? And so I remember, yeah, so I'm one of those people that remember the net before there was a web browser. So just kind of like go for Archie, IRC channels, maybe back when the net was pure, if you want to think of it that way, right? But it's very, very kind of early technology exposure in that sense.
So how old were you when you first got a taste of actual programming?
So I think I started programming in middle school. So I don't know what that, like 12, 13 roughly, is that sound about right?
Do you remember the first time you did some programming or hacking or something? You're like, wow, this works. Like I made something that works.
Yeah, so the first language I ever learned was BASIC.
Yes,
I think, however, my middle school teacher at the time was very proud because if you guys remember, BASIC is classically assigned, associated with having line numbers, right? It's like 10 something, 20 something, and you can do go to 10, which in modern programming language like don't ever use go to statements, right? But back in the day they did that. But my teacher, I guess, was kind of forward thinking in the sense that he didn't teach us BASIC in that sense. He actually made us write functions, which was a big deal for BASIC back then. So I learned BASIC, then I did Pascal next, and then I eventually did C. So that's kind of how it all started.
Cool. So what do you think's exciting today for kids that are growing up? We have a young guy here. How old is your son?
27, kind of.
Awesome. We've got a 6-year-old here listening to this presentation. So what do you think's exciting about these young kids who are growing up today and the opportunities they have?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think technology is so pervasive now, all right? I mean, because, for myself, so I have two boys, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, right? Obviously, and I guess, so one thing I'll just say is, maybe this makes me a terrible parent. So my son learned how to like swipe to unlock the iPhone at like 1 year old, right? So, like he was just like clamoring over my devices and causing all sorts of trouble, like rearranging my icons and deleting, like random stuff.
This is the real reason you invented Divide, was to give half the phone to your son and half the phone to yourself.
Huh? So I think, Divide, I mean, we can get into more, is, we started off thinking, it's a nice split between, kind of work and personal, right? But I think in reality, I was really going for kid mode, so I can basically have all my kid safe stuff partitioned off, and he doesn't have to like randomly calling people or deleting my business emails and things like that. So
yeah. Well, maybe this is a good segue. So let's talk about Divide. So how did it all get started? You guys were working together at Morgan Stanley, right? The three of you founders. Tell us about that whole story, how it got started. What were the first conversations?
Yeah. So I think I'm very lucky because my co-founders I've known for like almost like 10 years, a decade before we kind of started. So I think there was a lot of just good working relationship and trust, right? And I think so. If you really want to kind of go back to the beginning, a lot of this, as you alluded to, did come from our frustrations of having worked at Morgan Stanley, actually. So if you guys remember, there's this company called BlackBerry. They actually were quite successful. And they utterly and completely dominated the enterprise space for well over a decade, right? And I guess just a little more geeking out a little bit, right? So my first startup out of university was a company by the name of Jarna. I don't know how much internet presence they have now, but you can Google for them, I suppose. But so that was a mobile middleware company that really allowed first generation email calendar contacts to be accessible on a plethora of like devices, including like Windows CE, I guess, yeah. Basically, when Windows Phone was still called Windows CE way back when, on the Palm Pilots and also on the first generation BlackBerries, right? And I guess a little bit of trivia is, so the very, very first BlackBerries were actually mini 386 computers, right? So the chip inside was actually 386, and they ran on the pager network. So they weren't even like true cellular devices, if you think of it that way, right? But yeah, so we worked on the BlackBerry platform for a long time, right? And BlackBerry used to be the exclusive mobile platform for pretty much all enterprises in the world, right? And I think because of that, I think we were fortunate. For example, we were on the customer advisory councils of RIM and Microsoft, and given our position in IT, we were able to kind of give them feedback saying, these are kind of the enterprise features that we wish you guys would put into your platforms. And I mean, they listened to us, but I don't think they ever truly moved quickly in terms of adopting some of the suggestions that were put in, right? And so when Android came out, right, we saw it as a very interesting opportunity because I think for the first time it was an operating system that was open enough whereby you could change a lot of things, right? For example, if you want to change the dialer, if you want to change, the wallpaper, if you want to change the launcher, if you want to change all these things, you could actually do it, right? So that's kind of our impetus to say like, okay, let's go and try to do everything we ever wanted to put into a true like mobile enterprise product, and then take Android engines and see where we can go with it.
But your first idea wasn't Divide; it was something else entirely, right? That you were working on before.
With my existing co-founders, or is that what you're alluding to, or?
Well, with your co-founders, was Divide the first idea? Did you have this idea and you said, let's go do this, or was there a pivot in there somewhere?
Yeah, so again, I guess there's really no clear delineation in the sense that I've known these guys for a long time, right? So even before Divide, we would just randomly get together and just like bounce ideas off of each other and do random prototypes, right? But nothing that was serious enough where we said, oh, let's quit our jobs, let's go and try to raise some money, let's actually try to make a go of it, right? I mean, those were primarily, for example, like night and weekend projects, which I'm sure a lot of people are probably used to, right? Just, hey, I have an idea, let's just hack a little bit and maybe build a prototype and use it for like a week or two, and if you don't like it, it just kind of like died, right? So Divide was the first one where I think we felt there was enough of a potential behind it that we said, you know what, let's actually try to make a go of it.
It was serious at that point.
Right.
So then how did it turn from, hey, we're three guys with an idea and something here, to turning it into a business?
Yeah, so I think here we'll probably get into a bit of the financing stuff, right? So I think looking back, I think one area, again, where I think where we're very fortunate is that we have been in kind of the mobile enterprise space for a long time, right? And so we, just as everybody else, put together a deck, right? Hacked together some prototypes, and this was like Nexus 1 running Android 2.2 back in the day. And effectively, we went back to some of our old bosses, right? And basically showed them and be like, hey, what do you guys think, right? And I think we were lucky in that, they knew us because of our previous working relationships, and they were also kind of in the space. So they're like, yeah, it looks like this thing has legs. And then they basically filled out our first kind of like friends and family or bootstrap round, right? So that was, the convertible debt, which I think is a pretty popular instrument these days. So they just found an initial 500K of debt, and then, off we go. So.
Then what was the next stage in terms of funding? Because you had some larger funding rounds after that. What led to that? What allowed you to raise that larger round of capital?
Yeah, so I think the first round, I think we effectively closed early 2010, like January, right? I think that's when, because as you guys probably know, I moved to Hong Kong around Christmas '09. So I came out here, we incorporated the company. Okay, so speaking of a Hong Kong company, I guess we can go back to that a little bit, right? I think it certainly has a rightful claim in the sense that Hong Kong was the first place where Enterprise incorporated, right? Hong Kong was the first place where we actually hired, rented an office. Hong Kong's the first place where we hired our global #1 employee. Hong Kong has always been the largest office by headcount. So I think we do think of it as a very Hong Kong-centric company, right? That being said, the HQ has always been in New York because I think in some ways it's much easier to have a standard Delaware C Corp company, especially if you're raising venture money, right? It's just from a financing perspective, certainly for the traditional Silicon Valley US VCs, that's just much easier for them to deal with, right? So sorry, that was a random tangent.
But now you had a follow-on round financing, I think it was 11 million or something? Right?
Yeah, so we've done 3 rounds total. Then the one right after that was a 1.5 million series seed. That was led by a wonderful gentleman by the name of Gil Beta from GenaCast, right? And that one we basically raised in the fall of 2010, so about 10 months roughly from the time we first started working. So at that point, so the first one you can argue we really just raised on hopes and dreams and a PowerPoint, right? The next round of money, I personally believe, was the hardest round for us to raise because I think, once you get the initial money, the next time you go out for money, it's not hopes and dreams anymore. You can't. You
better have something.
Yes, you need to demonstrate a little bit of traction, right? So at that time, as I mentioned, originally, we thought Android was fantastic because it's very open. It allows us to do a lot of powerful things, kind of like at the OS level, right? So at the time, we took Android, we forked it. We were running our own version of Android. We called it ETPOS. Because back then, actually, so another funny thing. So back then, we were called Enterproid, right? And really, that's enterprise Android. So if you kind of smash it together, that's what we got. But as in hindsight, that's a terrible name because one, it's really difficult to say. Like no one can say it properly. Like people would say like Enterprod or and then Alex, my co-founder, claims that it rhymes with hemorrhoid. So it's really really bad connotations, right? But anyways, so back then we were extremely Android centric and also very kind of like at the OS level, right? Because like I said, it would boot up and I'll say the little ETPOS, and it was very cool from a very geeky tech perspective, right? So that, and very early on, our business model, and you can see we were quite naive back then, right? We thought that, hey, we'll take Android, which is very open, we'll make it more secure, we'll add all these enterprise features on top of it, then we'll just go license to all the manufacturers. Of course, everybody in the world would want to ship an enterprise-grade phone, right? So we thought that, we'll just build this technology, then we'll license like Samsung, LG, HTC, kind of just go down, and that would be the business model, right? Suffice to say, things didn't really turn out that way, right? Because I think once we actually started showing people, certainly like all of the VCs and investors basically saying, yeah, you know what, most people don't want to flash their phones to, make it enterprise grade, right? And, I think dealing with OEMs is not necessarily also the easiest thing in the world either, right? Because it's just a lot of complexity. And certainly I think, most startup, I think conventional wisdom is that you want to do an MVP, you want to iterate as quickly as possible, right? And when you really work at the OS level, it's very, very difficult. Especially, like I said, if you want to get a new build, and the only way you get a new build is to flash your phone, it kind of really slows things down a little bit, right? So we had that, and then when we went out and tried to raise money, because we felt like we had something, at least a little bit of traction, right? A lot of the feedback that we got was, like, you guys really need to think of a different way to kind of apply the technology you've built, because the go-to-market strategy was effectively not ideal, right?
And was it investors giving you this feedback, or who was giving you this feedback?
Investors, and then also some of the early customers that we went to, right? Because originally, like I said, the business model was we would target the OEMs, and that's how we would try to make money from. But then in order to convince the OEMs, we had to go to the customers saying, for example, like Morgan Stanley, we're like, well, would you guys buy some enterprise-grade phones? And I think, for example, that if we want to do a trial with Morgan Stanley, then we would have to flash their phones, and they were like, well, that's really a non-starter.
Right.
Right. And also interestingly, so I guess, everybody probably knows, so Google Ventures actually led our series, Google Ventures came in on our Series A investment, they actually led our Series B. But so we approached Google Ventures even for that initial round, right? And then Rich Miner, who is in Google Ventures, is a co-founder of Android, and through our connections, we eventually got in contact with him, and we basically pitched him. And I think actually this part,
that's a pretty good guy to get feedback.
Pretty good guy, and I think this part, if you read the Business Insider article, interestingly, I think Alex tells a funny story in there about a call that we had with Rich, right? But suffice to say, he actually told us, don't do it, right? Like what you guys, like the path you guys are going down is like a path of no return, and it's effectively a non-starter, right? And credit to Rich, I think that's really good feedback. And then we went back and basically said, okay, we're going to take everything we kind of did at the OS level, and now we're going to move it up the stack and try to make it an app where it's just available in the Play Store, anybody can download it, and it just will partition your phone in two, right? So I think it's with that pivot that Gil was basically willing to fund us, right? Because I think he saw that we had technical expertise, like we could actually build something, right? But I think Gil at the time basically had some discomfort around how exactly we were going to sell and go to market, right? Once having this bunch of little conversations, we decided to change kind of our technology direction, right? I think the vision has always stayed true in the sense that we want to split people's phones, right? Have basically like a personal side and a business side. It's really the implementation of achieving that end goal, right? And then another funny story here is, so Rich actually passed on that first round, right? And a lot of other VCs we talked to, of course, knew Rich, and they would call him and he'd be like, what do you think? And he'd be like, well, I'm passing, right? And then a lot of other people passed too. But then interestingly, GV came in on Series A, and then I think he got a lot of angry phone calls later saying, you told us to pass. But it's
he wasn't expecting you to listen to his advice, huh?
Yeah, so it's funny, because I think if you were to talk to Rich, he would say like, wow, you guys were one of the few companies that actually listened to me. And I was, so I think obviously, I think dealing with VCs can be tricky in a lot of different ways, right? And I think, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, I think you do need to think about when you're going to hold firm and when you're going to pivot, right? I think in this case, not that I'm really making excuses for ourselves, but I think that we stay true to our vision. But certainly in terms of the execution and the go-to-market strategy and how we realize that vision, definitely, I think that was the significant kind of transformation for us. Right.
So when you're raising all this money, that's exciting. People like you, they're giving you money and such. But were you affected by that? Were you thinking about the money, or were you just heads down in the code, focused on the business? What was it like at that stage of the business? Because a lot of people haven't been through that, but they think it's going to be so great when they get to that. What's the reality of being at that stage?
Yeah, so I think, for me personally, right, and I think maybe this is just a first-time founder type of situation. I've worked in plenty of startups, right? For example, at Smule, I was the first employee. But I think there's still a huge chasm between a founder and even like a founding employee, right? And I guess for me, maybe it's a confidence thing, right? Certainly, I think for a long time, I felt like raising money was like a goal in the sense that I think like I really wanted to raise money because I think it made us more comfortable in the sense that we feel like we're not crazy. There are other people who believe in the idea. So it was almost like a validation almost, right? It's more like, basically, I'm not the only one that believes in it enough that somebody else is willing to kind of like write me a check, right? So I think that was a big psychological look. Initially, it's like we really wanted that confirmation, right? But I think as time went by, for example, after we started raising subsequent rounds, I think the realization is that raising money, because I think perhaps many first-time entrepreneurs see raising money as kind of like the end goal, whereas really it's kind of like the start of what you really need to do. So I think for us, the later rounds were definitely a means to an end, right? I think, yes, of course, I think, and maybe the tech press is guilty of this in the sense that I think, for example, a lot of the times, there's all these wonderful headlines written about company X raises X million dollars. I think that's very, very exciting, right? But generally, I think, raising the money is good, but then ultimately, raising money is very distracting. It actually takes you away from running your business because there's all these meetings and things like that. So in reality, I think we were always very happy to raise the money and then put it behind us because then we can actually really concentrate on the business and building out the product.
At what point did, and maybe we're getting into the area where you can either deny nor confirm or talk about things, but at what point did you realize, wow, we might be acquired by somebody like Google or some big company, and when did it get exciting that way?
Yeah, so I think this part I can talk a little bit about. So we had acquisition offers pretty early on, right? Even after like series, like the first seed money that we raised, and after we did Series A, I think we've always had offers along the way, and I think in some ways it's always nice to be asked, right? I mean, like I guess a lot of people using dating analogies for startups for some reason, and like what I would say is this is kind of like you're the girl and you're at a dance, so it's always nice when other people ask you if you want to dance, I suppose, right? So in some ways, those were always very, very flattering, right? But I think, we never really, I think, looked to sell, to be honest, right? I think
So it was a bit of a surprise when it came along, or the real opportunity came, or you just weren't looking for it, but you knew people were out there?
Okay, yeah, maybe this. So, well, I will say that we have worked with Google for a long time, right? And not necessarily just on the financing side, because I think when you look at the Divide business, right, we target large enterprises, right? And as you guys probably know, most enterprises today are still use Exchange. I mean, that's probably like 90-something% of the market, right? But obviously, Google Apps, cloud in general is, of course, I think people think that's the future, right? And given that we have such strong Android technology, we've always had customers who were Google Apps users, right? So I think there was a natural intersection there. But again, I mean, that's just on business development side. I mean, that's not really acquisition, right? So in some ways, I think it's always very complicated in the sense that so Google, as just a huge entity, I mean, yes, they were an investor, they were potentially a business partner, and ultimately, they did acquire us. So they kind of filled all three roles, right? So that was maybe unique in some sense, maybe not. But I think, like I said, it's a very complicated situation. I don't know if I can...
Did it seem pretty natural, though, as it progressed to that acquisition point? Or was it, when it actually came down to that opportunity, were you guys blown away when Google came and said, we actually want to buy you out? Was it like, well, wow, this is...
Yeah, I mean, I think we are very excited to be part of Google, right? Certainly, I think that, for example, just quoting Android statistics, and this is all public, so I can quote it. I think even at I/O this year, they say Android now has 1 billion active users, right? And to me, the very, very exciting thing about joining Google is that I think Divide as a standalone company, of course, we won and we had sales and we're trying to close enterprise customers. But I think to really, truly do things at Google scale is very, very exciting, right? So.
Yeah. Now, you had about 70 employees when you guys got acquired, is that right?
I think we're about 70 global, yeah.
Yeah. And now, how did people feel, how did the employees feel when the acquisition was announced that you guys were going to become part of Google? What was the general reaction?
Yeah, so I think everybody was excited, right? And I guess maybe we can talk specifically about Hong Kong for a second, since we are in Hong Kong, right? So I think the various startup events I've gone to over the years, one thing that I've constantly come back to is recruiting is hard. And I think you can argue recruiting is hard anywhere, right? It doesn't matter if it's Silicon Valley, if it's Hong Kong. But I think one thing I will call out about Hong Kong specifically is that generally this is a financial hub, and the best and the brightest traditionally do not study tech, and maybe US has this problem as well, right? It's like they'll go study risk management or finance, and they'll be lawyers or doctors or other things, right? And here, just as for example, a lot of the startup systems back in the West, a lot of the fresh blood that comes in are basically fresh graduates, right, out of the university programs. And one of the challenges for me is that, of course, Divide is not really that well known. I mean, obviously, over the years, we've gotten bigger and gotten more PR, which is fantastic, right? But for example, when I go out recruiting here in Hong Kong and I make somebody an offer for one of these fresh graduates when they go home, maybe they'll have a sit down with their mom and dad, and they'll be like, okay, mom, I have an offer from HSBC or Goldman Sachs or Credit Suisse or some investment bank, and I have an offer from this company Divide, which you've never heard of, right? And I want to go work for Divide, and the parents be like, no, you will not go work for Divide. So I know that's actually a very difficult conversation for a lot of the local students, right? And I think I feel very lucky in the sense that a lot of them ultimately chose to work for us, right? So for example, when we got acquired by Divide, I think it was almost a moment of vindication for them in the sense that they can go back to their mom and dad and be like, see, I made the right choice, right? So I think that was very nice in the sense that they were able to go back and say that. Well, not really in a I told you so kind of way, but I think, like I said, it's more like, I think, it gives them validation again, right? That and hopefully, I think this will serve as an example to other, aspiring startups or other entrepreneurs in Hong Kong. Because I think, it is difficult, right? But certainly I feel like the city, the ecosystem here, it has gone much, much better over the last 5 years.
Now, you came here in 2009. What originally brought you to Hong Kong?
Yeah, so funnily, then it's actually got nothing to do with the startup at all. So I am ethnically Chinese, but as you said, I grew up in Arizona, where there's not a lot of Asians, to be honest. Supposedly I have a pretty good Spanish accent, actually. But anyways, I got married, and my wife, who actually is from Hong Kong, and actually both of my children are born here in Hong Kong. But we all went back to the U.S., right? Because I think that's where my career was, that's where my family was. But after having 2 kids, we had a pretty long discussion about how we want to raise them. And one thing that we agreed upon was that we want them to be fluently bilingual, English and Chinese. And I also had friends who grew up going to Chinese school over the weekends, and let's just say their level of Chinese proficiency is not very good. And so we made the choice to kind of like pick up and relocate to Hong Kong, and that's how we ended up here in Hong Kong.
Interesting. So what do you think are, now having started a business in Hong Kong, harvested a business in Hong Kong, what are your thoughts on the startup scene here, the progress it's made? What do you think are some of the good things, bad things about the startup scene here?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, I think it's come a long, long way, right? So there was a panel earlier this week. Well, I guess maybe the audience won't have no idea what I'm talking about, but basically it was a kind of a 5-year reunion of sorts for kind of the startup scene here in Hong Kong. And for example, one interesting statistic that was quoted was that, back at the end of 2009, there was 0 co-working spaces here in Hong Kong. I think today, if you count, it's like 30-something plus almost 40 co-working spaces. There are a much more well-developed angel seed ecosystem here now, right? I think a lot of startups have started in Hong Kong, then gone on to join, for example, like Y Combinator or 500 startups. So generally, the system is developing here, which I think is fantastic.
So what do you think are some of the core advantages that Hong Kong has for startups? What kind of startups can do well here, do you think? Better perhaps here than in other places? Yeah,
I mean, generally, I think like one huge benefit that we derived from Hong Kong, right, is obviously I think there's a huge savings in terms of labor costs, and just, the cost of engineering in Hong Kong is just much, much better, right? I guess, so going back to our Divide days, we've raised a lot of money, right? It's 25 million in aggregate over 3 rounds. But even early on, after we raised the 1.5 million, our investor, commented on the fact that, our burn rate was effectively half that of a company half our size in the U.S., right? So, that's pretty significant if you think about, the amount of runway basically that it afforded us, right? In terms of being able to like take our time or basically hire a bigger team than you otherwise would, right? In terms of just growing the business and being able to iterate quickly. So I think that's a definitely advantage for Hong Kong, right? And then in addition, I think infrastructure here is fantastic, really fast internet speeds, the wireless penetration is amazing. I can use my phone on the subway and elevators and things like that, which is pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, we get a little bit spoiled with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So looking back at your younger self or a young entrepreneur today, what's some of the advice that you would have for people who are just getting started with their businesses?
So I think one advice that I have, and I think a lot of people ask me, and I guess we talked about earlier, is how did we come up with the idea, or how did we decide to build Divide, right? And I think that it is a lot of it is the fact that like me and my co-founders, we have worked in the space for over a decade, even 15 years, right? Now I realize not all startups are like that, but certainly I think when you target, for example, say the enterprise market, or basically not a startup that takes a picture of your phone and picture of your dinner and share with your friends, having in-depth expertise or like domain knowledge in an area I think really helps, right? Because I think ultimately I think that is what allowed us to navigate successfully through some of the really tough product decisions or choices you have to make to say who your customer is, what market are you really going after, what problem are you trying to solve, right? I think that served us really well.
Now you have co-founders. There are some entrepreneurs out there who say, well, I don't want to share, I want to go it alone, I can move faster, I can be more nimble. What do you think what are some of the pros and cons about having partners?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are statistics out there saying, like the number of co-founders versus the overall success rate of a startup, right? I believe the sweet spot is actually 2. Right. In some ways, I think maybe we're an oddball because we're 3, right? But then you can also say that 3 is kind of the most stable configuration of a physical thing. So I think in some ways, for us, I think having 3 really worked, right? Personally, I don't think I would have been able to do this without my co-founders. So I think a lot of the credit and kudos definitely goes out to Andrew and Alex, right? And I think also for us, because we're 3 people, each person had a slightly different point of view or slightly different area of expertise, and I think we were really able to use that to our advantage. For example, Alex was like the most creative one, right? For example, like while Andrew and I might be kicking out some technical architecture, he would be like, no, this is pointless if it's not easy to use, right? So I think it's nice to have some of those different points of view or counterbalances, especially when you're making some of these critical decisions.
Let's. What are some of the Was there any point in the business when you got worried about the business, or was it fairly stable all the way through?
I think we were lucky again in the sense that, because I think a lot of times people ask you, is there a moment you kind of look death in the face and realizing, oh my God, potentially like we're not going to make it. I wouldn't say we had an existential crisis like that, but certainly I think. Like going back in hindsight, I think one mistake that I'll personally take accountability for is that we were very Android focused at the time, right? Personally when we first started, and I resisted building the iOS version of Divide for a long time, right? And as most programs probably know, Android and iOS ultimately are pretty different in terms of what each platform allows you to do. And I felt that on iOS, it was impossible effectively to recreate the amazing, beautiful experience we had on Android, right? So for a long time I said, I refuse to build a subpar product. Then, ultimately, but then, once we try to go to the market, most enterprises don't want to deploy a solution that only worked for half their fleet, right? They're like, well, it's great for my Android users, but what about this other platform over here? So, so eventually we did do Divide for iOS, and it was actually quite successful, right? And I think, so one lesson for me there is I think it was unfair for me to compare kind of like Divide iOS and Divide Android in the sense that it's really not an apples-to-apple comparison, because ultimately your iOS users doesn't care about the Android experience. They just want the best experience on iOS. So in the sense that like once I kind of made that mental shift, I think it made a lot more sense, because then we just built the best Divide we could for iOS, and then that turned out to be good enough, right? Like it didn't have to be a port of Divide for Android onto Divide for iOS, right? So lesson learned.
Yeah, great. What are some of the things that you think are exciting these days in the mobile space? What technologies are coming out that you think are the future?
Yeah, so we just had a conversation about this, before the interview. I am personally very, very bullish on wearables, right? I think just mobile in general. I think during the time of Divide, I think, a lot of the talks I've been given to people basically says, death of the desktop, right? Death of the laptop. It's going to be a mobile world, and it is. I mean, I think smartphone shipments now outsell all desktops and laptops combined. But I think it's only the beginning, right? I think that mobile is going to go in a much more personal way above and beyond even just smartphones. Because I think smartphones are getting bigger and bigger. The screen size seems to be getting bigger and bigger. Yeah. They don't fit into my pockets anymore pretty soon. And I think alternate screens and alternate, like wearables or, like glass or these other things, I think will add themselves into our lives. And I think that'll make things just much more human in some ways, because I think it'll be even tighter integrated with everything we do.
Uh-huh. Does everybody who works for Google get free Google Glass?
I don't think so. Though then again, I think historically Google is very good about giving out Christmas presents, right? So I have no idea what's being given out this year. Maybe it's glass, maybe it's not. I have no idea.
We'll see. Is there anything that you're working on right now at Google that you can talk about that's exciting, or is that all top secret?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we'll have to stay away from that particular topic. But that being said, I think things will be forthcoming, shortly, because, like I said, part of the excitement of joining Google is that we really do want to change the world, right? So I think, there's no better place to do it than at Google. So. Yeah.
Is the company or your team, is it growing here in Hong Kong? Is it growing in London or New York? Or where did the team end up kind of settling? Or is it kind of spread out all over?
Yeah, I mean, so we're still spread out. I mean, Google is obviously a global company, right? So, they have offices worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how many, can you say how many of your team members were here in Hong Kong when the acquisition happened?
Yeah, I think we're about 30.
About 30?
Yeah.
And are those people mostly still working for Google, or?
Yes, so I think, yep, they're all at Google.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to open it up for Q&A now. So what are the questions that you want to ask? What do you want to know from David about Google, Divide, whatever?
Question. Are you still on Mac?
Yes, so I am still on Mac. I am running Yosemite.
Yeah, me too.
Yep. So,
if it wasn't for Google, would you see your company being acquired by someone else, and would you see yourself working for someone else?
I guess ultimately there's really only ever two kind of exits, right? I mean, well, technically three. So you can go completely flame out of business, which is nice, or you can get acquired, or of course you can always carry on life as an independent company. And I guess, going back to your earlier question of, what kind of made us quit our jobs and kind of just jump in is, I think, behind this idea, yeah, I think, if the stars aligned perfectly and if we really pushed and if we carried on, maybe one day we could have gone public, right? But I think, again, quoting statistics, I think, the vast majority of startups nowadays end up being acquired, I think like 80–90%, right? So I think for us, if you want to play the odds, I think we would acquire at some point, right? But I think in terms of potential acquirers, certainly just speaking for myself, completely personal, I think Google is a very, very exciting place to work. It's an amazing technology company. So I think in terms of where we call home, I think that's very, very nice. So,
yeah. What do you think? Where your kids will go to school and for college for university?
Yeah. So I guess as a parent, I actually think about this problem a lot, right? And okay, maybe I'm going to get political for a second and start criticizing education systems. So I think traditionally, for example, Asia or China gets a lot of bad press in the sense that it's all like rote memorization, right? It's like the students don't really learn independent thought; they just regurgitate textbooks. The entire education is catered towards basically taking the next exam to get you into your next school. For example, you take the test to get into preschool, then you get into kindergarten, then you get into elementary school, then you get into right. So I think that's the criticism against the more Eastern, perhaps, education systems, right? Now, that being said, I personally believe that, for example, the basics, for example, like arithmetic, addition, subtraction, division, times tables, you either know it or you don't, right? I mean, I think there's no ambiguity around, well, can you do math or can't you do math, right? So I actually appreciate that kind of like early foundational type of stuff, which I think is actually good, right? But then I think when you look at the pros, for example, of the U.S. education system, it's that once you're older, for example, like starting in middle school or high school, there's all these clubs, right? You can do like drama or like start your own computer science club, or you can go take universities at the local. Basically there's a lot more choice, and you're encouraged to explore your intellectual curiosity and try to find what you really enjoy studying, right? Whereas again, I think then the criticism is in Asia, you don't, because you're just so obsessed about the next test to get you into whatever, right? So me personally, my grand plan, if you want to call it that, is so my kids will grow up in Hong Kong, they'll learn the basics, and they'll learn it really well. And then as they're older, they're going to go back to the States probably and then finish up their schooling over there because...
You don't see any chance in Hong Kong to establish this kind of education where people have choice?
I mean, ultimately, I don't really know what the education policy of Hong Kong is, to be honest. But that's just kind of my high level of thinking of kind of if you really had to take the best from both systems, right? I think that's what I would try to put together for my children.
Yeah, I see the point. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David, for coming. Let's give him a round. Thank you very much.